the prayer that shouldn't have been answered. The storm raged outside, rattling the windows of the small-town church as Father Michael sat alone in the dim candlelight. The power had gone out an hour ago, plunging the sanctuary into eerie shadows. He had seen many storms in his 40 years of service, but something about this night felt wrong. The wooden pews creaked, though the church was empty. The large crucifix above the altar cast a twisted shadow on the back wall. With a deep breath, Father Michael clasped his hands together and prayed. Lord, protect this house of faith. Deliver us from the evils that lurk in the dark. A sudden knock echoed through the church, sharp and deliberate. It was well past midnight. No one should have been out in the storm. Hesitant, he rose, his robes brushing against the cold stone floor. When he opened the heavy oak doors, a man stood there, drenched from head to toe. Kazil. His eyes were hollow, his face pale. He held a soaked Bible in his trembling hands. Father, the man whispered, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. I need to confess. The stranger's tale. Father Michael ushered the man inside and sat him in the front pew. He noticed the way the man's hands shook, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something terrible. My name is Jacob, the man began, staring at the flickering candles. And I did something unforgivable. The priest remained silent, allowing the man to unburden himself. I was a missionary, sent to a remote village deep in the mountains. The people there, they believed in something ancient, something powerful. I thought they were lost souls, needing salvation. Jacob swallowed hard, his breath hitching. They had this ritual, he continued. Every full moon, they gathered in the church they built, not for worship, but for protection. They weren't praying to God, they were praying against something. Father Michael felt a cold shiver travel down his spine. They called it the Watcher in the Dark, Jacob whispered. A demon, a shadow, something that listened when they prayed. And if they ever stopped, he trailed off, his eyes darting around as if afraid it might be listening even now. Jacob took a deep, shuddering breath. I thought it was just superstition, so I stopped them. I told them that God would protect them, and that they no longer needed to beg for mercy from a demon that didn't exist. His voice cracked as he spoke the next words. That night, they all disappeared. Father Michael's blood ran cold, a pact with the unseen. Jacob's face was pale as he continued. The entire village, gone. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just emptiness. Their homes remained, their livestock stood in their pens, but the people... He shook his head, his hands gripping the Bible as if it were the only thing anchoring him to reality. I fled. I ran as fast as I could down the mountain. I swore never to speak of it again, but then it followed me. Father Michael felt the weight of the confession settle over him like a heavy shroud. Every night since, I hear it whispering. I see its shadow moving, in places where there shouldn't be any light. I wake up to find my furniture shifted, my windows open, my Bible turned to the same verse. Jacob's voice dropped to a fearful murmur. Job 2:2. Father Michael knew it well. And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord, and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. I think, Jacob's breath hitched, I think I made a terrible mistake. The candles flickered violently. The storm outside seemed to grow quieter, as if something was listening, watching, waiting. Father Michael swallowed hard, his pulse hammering. He had spent his life devoted to faith, to light, to God. But what if faith itself had rules that should never be broken? "What must I do, Father?" Jacob whispered. "How do I atone?" A deep, guttural voice, not human, answered from the darkness. "You don't." The last candle went out. The church plunged into darkness. Jacob screamed. Father Michael never saw what took him. Only the echo of his final prayer remained, lingering in the silent church like a warning. And then a slow, deliberate knock came at the church doors once more. The old St. Augustine chapel had stood for nearly 2 centuries, its grand stained glass windows depicting biblical scenes in hauntingly vivid colors. Time had weathered its walls, but the choir remained as strong as ever. Every Sunday, their voices rose like angels in worship, filling the air with reverence and beauty. But some songs should never be sung. Father Elias, the head priest, had always found solace in the music of the church. The choir was his pride and joy, a harmonious group of devoted singers who poured their souls into each hymn. But lately, something about their voices had changed. It had started subtly, a strange echo when they sang, as if another voice, or perhaps many voices, were harmonizing just beyond the range of human hearing. The congregation noticed, whispering about how the music now felt different, hollow, ethereal. It was Sister Anne who first voiced what everyone feared. "Father," she had whispered one evening as they cleaned the chapel, "I think someone else is singing with us." Father Elias laughed softly. "That's the point of harmony, sister." "No," she said, shaking her head. "I mean someone else. Someone who isn't here." He dismissed it as nerves, a trick of acoustics in the vast, echoing chapel. But then, the letters started arriving. The letters from the departed. At first, Father Elias assumed they were notes from visitors, letters left behind in the pews, scribbled prayers requesting blessings. But these letters were different. The paper was yellowed, crumbling, as though decades old. Yet the ink was fresh. And the names, they were all names of former choir members, long-dead choir members. Father Elias unfolded the latest letter with trembling hands. The message was simple, scrawled in an unsteady hand. "We still sing." He shuddered. It had to be a hoax, a cruel joke. But the next Sunday, as the choir took their places, something changed. The air grew heavy, thick with something unseen. And when they sang the opening hymn, Father Elias heard them. Voices, dozens, maybe hundreds, singing along. But they were not part of the choir. They came from nowhere, from everywhere, from beneath the choir's curse. The realization hit Father Elias like a physical blow. He stumbled forward, gripping the altar for support. The congregation sat frozen in their pews, wide-eyed, their faces pale. They heard it too. Sister Anne gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She pointed a shaking finger toward the back of the chapel. There, in the flickering candlelight, stood the choir. Not the living choir, but those who had sung here before. Their faces were gaunt, hollow-cheeked, their eyes sunken and dark. They stood motionless, their mouths open, though no breath stirred their chests. And yet, they sang. Father Elias felt his knees weaken. It was true. The choir had never stopped singing, not even in death. The music swelled, filling every crevice of the chapel. It was hypnotic, beautiful in its horror. The congregation sat paralyzed, trapped by the melody. And then the dead stepped forward, a pact in blood. Father Elias tried to move, to speak, to pray, but his voice failed him. The spirits advanced, their feet soundless against the cold stone floor. Their song grew louder, more desperate. They weren't here to harm, they were here to warn. The letters, the voices, the ghostly choir. They had been trying to deliver a message, and then Father Elias saw him. the old choir director, Father Emmanuel, who had died nearly 50 years ago. His spectral form loomed at the center of the ghostly choir, his hollow eyes locked onto Elias. With great effort, he lifted one trembling hand and pointed down. Father Elias's breath caught. The floor! He had always known the chapel had a crypt below, but it had been sealed for generations. Few even remembered it existed, but something was still down there. The choir's voices twisted into something urgent, pleading, and then the floor cracked. The sound of splintering stone echoed through the chapel as a deep fissure tore through the aisle. The congregation screamed, scrambling back as thick black mist coiled up from the depths. And then, from that darkness, came the sound of something moving, not singing, breathing. Something was waking up. Father Elias realized, too late, what the ghosts had been trying to say. The choir had never sung for the congregation. They had been singing to keep something buried. And now, it was free. The village of Black Hollow was known for its silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that brought peace. It was the kind that whispered of things long buried, of secrets left unspoken. The church stood at the center of it all, ancient and unyielding, its steeple rising against the gray sky like a skeletal finger pointing toward judgment. At the heart of this village's tradition was a man, one who carried the sins of the dead on his shoulders. They called him the Sin Eater. Nathaniel Cole had inherited the role from his father, just as his father had before him. It was a duty, a curse, passed down through generations. When someone died, he was summoned to their bedside, where a meal was placed upon the deceased's chest. A ritual offering. Bread, salt, and ale. Simple, yet sacred. By eating it, Nathaniel was believed to consume the sins of the departed, taking their transgressions upon himself so that they could pass into the afterlife cleansed. But no one ever asked what happened to the sins once they entered the Sin Eater. No one ever questioned what became of the man who bore the weight of the damned, the last summons. The night it happened, the village was restless. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, as if the wind carried the echoes of old pyres. Nathaniel was preparing for sleep when the knock came at his door. Slow, deliberate. He already knew who it was before he opened it. A young boy stood in the flickering light of the lanterns, his face pale. "Mr. Cole," he whispered. "The widow Langley. She's passed." Nathaniel sighed. He had known it was coming. The widow had been sick for months, and he had already prepared himself for the call. He grabbed his worn satchel, the same one his father had carried before him, and followed the boy through the winding dirt paths of Black Hollow. The house was quiet when they arrived. Too quiet. Nathaniel had attended many deathbeds before, but something about this one felt wrong. The villagers stood in a tight circle outside the widow's cottage, their faces drawn with something that was not just grief. It was fear. Nathaniel stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots. The room was dimly lit, the air stale with the scent of sickness and candle wax. Widow Langley's body lay upon the bed, her face turned toward the ceiling, lips slightly parted as if she had been caught mid-whisper. And upon her chest, the final meal waited. Bread, salt, ale. But something was different this time. The bread was darker than it should have been, as if scorched from within. The salt was clumped together, tinged with something that looked like rust, and the ale was black. Nathaniel's stomach twisted. This was not an ordinary sin. This was something else, something ancient. The taste of damnation. He hesitated, the air growing heavier with each second. He had done this ritual 1,000 times before, but never had he felt this kind of resistance, this unnatural weight pressing against his chest. The villagers outside whispered among themselves. They knew the rules. The meal had to be eaten, or the dead would not pass on. Worse yet, their sins would linger, infecting the land, the people, the very soul of the village itself. Nathaniel swallowed hard. He could feel them watching, waiting. With shaking hands, he picked up the bread and took a bite. Bitter, rotten. It was like chewing on ashes, like swallowing embers that smoldered long after they should have died out. He forced it down. The salt came next. It burned his tongue, stung the inside of his cheeks. It tasted of iron, of blood, of something far older than any sin he had consumed before. And then, the ale. Nathaniel hesitated. The thick black liquid shimmered in the dim candlelight, moving like ink, like shadows curling around the rim of the cup. One sip, that was all it took. The moment it passed his lips, he felt it. The weight, the presence. It clawed its way down his throat, seeping into his veins, curling around his bones like 1,000 grasping fingers. His vision darkened, the room twisting and warping as a low, guttural whisper filled his ears. He dropped the cup, clutching his throat. His body convulsed. And then he saw her, Widow Langley, standing at the foot of her own bed, her mouth stretched wide, far wider than it should have been. Her eyes were black pits, empty and infinite. And from her lips came a sound. No, a chorus. Voices layered upon voices. Voices of the dead. Voices of the damned. It was never just our sins, Nathaniel. His breath came in ragged gasps. You never ate only sins. The whisper curled around him, tightening like a noose. You ate us, the truth of the sin eater. Nathaniel collapsed onto the floor, the voices screaming inside his skull. He had always believed that by consuming the final meal, he was taking the burden of their sins upon himself, but that had been a lie. The ritual had never been about cleansing. It had been about binding. He wasn't just consuming their sins, he was consuming them, their souls, their suffering, their existence. And now, they were inside him. Widow Langley's grin widened, her head tilting at an impossible angle. It's too much now, Nathaniel. You can't hold us all. His body trembled, his fingers clawing at the wooden floor as the weight of generations pressed down upon him. The villagers outside waited in silence. They had always known. They had always known the sin-eater was never meant to survive. Nathaniel opened his mouth to scream, but only silence escaped. And then, one by one, the candles flickered out. In the darkness, the voices rose in unison. Hunger, desperation, and the echoes of every soul he had ever consumed, rising in a song that would never end. Because Nathaniel Cole had become the final meal, the last sin-eater. And the hunger would never stop. The town of Millhurst had always been quiet, tucked away between rolling hills and dense forests. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where the church bells rang every Sunday without fail. At the heart of the town stood St. Hallowd's Church, a towering structure of ancient stone and stained glass, untouched by time. It had been there for centuries, long before the town itself was founded, and it held a secret. No one knew who had built it. No records existed of its construction, but it had always been there, waiting. The man who prayed too loudly. Father Thomas had served as the church's priest for the last 20 years. He was a man of unwavering faith, a shepherd to his small congregation. But there was one thing about St. Hallowd's that had always unsettled him. The back room. It was a small windowless chamber at the rear of the church, hidden behind the choir loft. A single wooden door stood at its entrance, old and rotting, covered in deep scratches that no one could explain. The previous priest, Father Samuel had warned him about the room on his first day. Do not open it. Do not enter it. Do not pray too loudly near it. Father Thomas had laughed at the old man's words, dismissing them as the ramblings of someone worn down by years of solitude. But now, as he stood alone in the candlelit church, the warning echoed in his mind. Because tonight, the scratching had started again. It came from behind the door, slow, deliberate. Something was inside, and it wanted out. The forbidden door. Father Thomas swallowed hard, gripping his Bible tighter. For years, he had ignored the sounds, the whispers, the shadows that sometimes moved beneath the door when no one else was around. But tonight, the air felt different, heavy, thick with something unseen. He approached the door cautiously, pressing a trembling hand against the wood. The scratching stopped. Silence. Then, a voice, low, hoarse, barely above a whisper. Father, his breath hitched. Let me out. The voice was familiar, too familiar. His pulse quickened as he stepped back, shaking his head. This was a trick, a test of faith. He clutched the cross around his neck and whispered a prayer. The air turned ice cold. The candles in the church flickered violently, and then the voice spoke again. Have you forgotten me, Father? His blood ran cold, because he knew that voice. It was Father Samuel, the man who had died 10 years ago. The prayer that went too far. Father Thomas staggered back, his mind raced. This wasn't possible. Father Samuel had been buried in the cemetery behind the church. He had attended the funeral himself, had watched as the coffin was lowered into the earth. And yet, the voice was unmistakable. You left me here. The words slithered through the darkness, wrapping around him like a noose. You let me die. No, he whispered, gripping the Bible tighter. You were at peace. You found rest. A slow, rasping chuckle came from behind the door. No one who serves this church finds rest. The temperature plummeted. Father Thomas could see his breath in the air, could feel the weight of something unseen pressing against him. He needed to leave. He turned to run, and the door burst open. The thing that wore his friend's face. Father Thomas stumbled back as darkness poured from the open doorway, thick and suffocating, swallowing the candlelight. And then something stepped out. It looked like Father Samuel. But it wasn't. The figure that emerged was tall, too tall, its limbs stretching unnaturally. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, as if drained of all light, and its eyes, black, empty, endless. You prayed too loudly, Thomas. The voice was warped now, layered with something deeper, something older. And you opened the door. Father Thomas tried to speak, to recite a prayer, but his throat locked. The figure moved closer. Its movements slow, deliberate. Do you know why this church has no history? He couldn't answer. Because it was never meant to be found. The shadows behind it shifted, moving like living things. They built it around the door. Cold realization settled over him. The church had never been a sanctuary. It had been a prison. A shudder ran through him as he recalled the scratches on the door, the whispers in the night, the warnings from Father Samuel. This thing, it had been locked away for centuries, and he had just set it free. The figure grinned, its mouth stretching far too wide. Now, Father, it's your turn to take my place. The last candle flickered out, and the church, once filled with prayer, fell into silence. The small town of Ashvale had only one church, a humble whitewashed building with a rusting iron bell that rang every Sunday without fail. The townsfolk were devoted, never missing a service, never questioning their preacher. But they should have, because Reverend Matthias was no ordinary man of God, and his sermons were not meant for the living. The man who knew too much, Reverend Matthias, had come to Ashvale 20 years ago. A quiet man with kind eyes and a voice that could soothe even the most restless soul. He never spoke of where he came from, and no one asked. But there was something about him, something unsettling. He knew things he shouldn't. When old Henry Lawson fell sick, the Reverend arrived at his bedside before the doctor was even called. When young Abigail wandered too close to the river and nearly drowned, the Reverend was already there, waiting. And when Mrs. Calloway whispered to her neighbor about leaving town, she never woke up the next morning. The people of Ashvale told themselves it was coincidence, that their preacher was simply blessed with divine foresight. But then the grave appeared, the nameless grave. It was discovered one morning behind the church, a fresh mound of earth where no burial had been planned. The townsfolk gathered in hushed confusion, staring at the unmarked wooden cross sticking from the soil. No one knew who had been buried there, and no one wanted to ask. That Sunday, Reverend Matthias stood at the pulpit as always, his voice deep and measured. "There is a great evil in this world," he said, "a darkness that waits at the edges of our faith, always watching, always listening." His gaze swept over the congregation, cold and knowing. "But it will not take you, not as long as I am here." The people nodded, reassured by his words. But one man wasn't. Jonathan Morrow, the town's gravedigger, had seen something the others hadn't. He had seen the Reverend in the graveyard the night before, digging. The deal with the darkness. That night, Jonathan returned to the graveyard. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the only sound the distant hoot of an owl. The nameless grave was still there. But now, there were more. 3 fresh mounds of soil, 3 unmarked graves. A shiver crawled down his spine. He turned toward the church, its tall steeple cutting into the night sky like a jagged knife. A flicker of light glowed from the window. Someone was inside. He crept closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. Peering through the stained glass window, he saw him. Reverend Matthias stood before the altar, his back to the door, his head bowed in prayer. But he wasn't alone. A figure stood opposite him, shrouded in darkness. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The thing had no face, just a void where its features should have been. Its long skeletal fingers twitched at its sides, and though it had no mouth, it spoke. A voice, like crackling fire and rusted metal, slithered through the air. "You owe me 3 more." Jonathan stumbled back, his foot crunching against a fallen branch. Inside, the Reverend's head snapped up. Jonathan ran. The last sermon. The next morning, the townsfolk gathered for Sunday service, unaware of what had transpired the night before. Reverend Matthias took his place at the pulpit, his face calm, his hands steady. "Today," he said, "we pray for those we have lost." His eyes locked onto Jonathan, who sat near the back, pale and trembling. "And for those who will be lost." Jonathan's blood ran cold. The sermon continued as usual, but the air felt different, thick, suffocating. The church doors never opened during the service. But that day, they did. A gust of wind howled through the chapel, snuffing out the candles, plunging the room into darkness. The townsfolk gasped, clutching their rosaries, their hands shaking. And then, a whisper, a voice that did not belong to any living man. "Matthias, your time is up." A shadow slithered through the open doors, moving against the walls like living ink. Reverend Matthias stood firm, his hands gripping the pulpit. "No," he said, his voice steady. "Not yet." The shadow pulsed, grew, and then the church screamed. The walls trembled, the pews rattling against the floor. The stained glass windows shattered inward, shards of colored glass slicing through the air. Jonathan tried to move, but his body refused to obey, because now he understood. The Reverend had not been saving them. He had been offering them. A deal made long ago, one life at a time. And now the debt was due. The shadow lunged forward, engulfing the Reverend in a whirl of darkness. For a moment, there was silence, and then the screaming started. The end of faith. When the sun rose over Ashvale the next morning, the church was empty. The doors stood open, swinging gently in the breeze. The pulpit was gone. The pews were overturned. And at the altar, where the Reverend had stood, a new grave had appeared, unmarked, unnamed, waiting. The townsfolk did not speak of what happened. They never entered the church again, but on quiet nights, when the wind blew through the trees, they swore they could still hear it, the voice of their preacher, whispering from beneath the earth.